Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source. History as psychohistory. We should look at history more accurately as psychohistory. In other words, the psychological result of an undergoing certain historical circumstances and experiences. We as individuals are our history. I'll show you later on that history is not that which is forgotten and left behind. We don't leave history behind. History is the present. History is the future. Those of us who are Afrocentric and mystical must know that the division of past, present, and future is false, Eurocentric, and political. The world is not a linear structure. Past, present, and future are one and the same. When we have been made to believe that the past is separate and in some straight line with the future, then we've already been brainwashed and set up. Our past never forgets us and is never left behind. If you forget your past, you would not be able to understand me right now. You would not be able to walk or talk. You did not learn to walk, talk, and do the things you're doing at this moment you entered here. At the moment you entered here, you learned to do them in the past. Forget that then, since that is history. Leave that behind. You will see that you also have no future. Past, present, and future are one. And that proposition is at the center of an African-centered history and approach. As men with their knowledge and desire ultimately make history, so does history make men. This is quoted from Joel Covell's White Racism, a Prehistory. When we go see a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, or psychotherapist, one of the first things they do is take a so-called case history. They recognize that they cannot appropriately understand us as individuals unless they understand something about our unique experience as individuals. They cannot take the history and the experiences of another person and apply exclusively the psychology that flows from that history and experience and accurately describe you as an individual and person. That's why each person that walks through the door of helping professionals must provide his or her own case history and must be dealt with in terms of his or her own case history. The same thing is true about people. We cannot take the psychology of Europeans, and often I've stated this as a rationale for my writing of the book, The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, which is based upon the history and experience upon their values and their goals, and apply it unmodified to ourselves. This leads to misunderstanding and misdirection. One of our major problems, I often point out in this context, in the area of education, is that we have a situation where the educational psychology that's taught to teachers and others who are in charge of our children is a psychology based on the history and experience of another people. And despite our best intentions, the best intentions of these educators, they are misleading our children in terms of that psychology. To a very great extent, the problem with the education of Black children, the crack epidemic, and all of these other things we complain about day in and day out are a result of the psychology that flows from a particular type of historical experience. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks for tuning in. We have a school system that is based upon the psychology of white children and white people. We are trying to educate our children in that system. They are bound to fail. The very structure of the educational system itself is based upon a white model, and therefore it has built-in failure mechanisms for us, one way or the other. We must develop a psychology of our children based upon our own history and experience. It is only then that our pedagogical and educational approaches will be in line with their personalities. Only then can we move our children forward to fulfill our needs and our desires as a people. If we wish to understand ourselves and wish to understand other people's psychology, we must then understand our history and their history. We must be very clear about this matter. For us to come to understand ourselves as individual units, we must ultimately come to understand not only our own personal history and experience, but the history and experience of our people, since they overlap and are connected. Therefore, it is through studying the history of our people that we come to understand ourselves as individuals and as a people. Although each person in a society is unique in the detail and fine structure of his or her life, all members of that society share certain common styles of action or ways of knowing. In other words, to the degree that we share history and experience, we share common styles of thinking and knowing. There is no such thing as an individual in the absolute sense of the word. Did you hear that? Rugged individualism is killing us. It's not a thing, and we need to educate our own children. Language and power. When we get ready to create revolution, we must redefine the world and redefine words. There is no way around it. In Genesis, we see Adam being given the power to name things. Through being given the power to name things, he is given dominion. There is a connection between naming and dominion. between naming and bringing into reality. When we permit another people to name and define, we permit another people to gain dominion and control over us. The languages that people learn and speak are most frequently directly related to the power relations between them. Most people will now learn Japanese. As for a while, they learned Russian. As for a while, they learned German, Latin, etc. Because the people who speak or spoke those languages were in the ascendance or in power at this or that time. There is no good English or bad English or good language or bad language. There is a language that is connected to power. People tend to learn first after their native tongue whatever language is spoken by the people in power. That's a connection between the capacity to have other people speak your language and to call things by the names you give them, and power. If we wish to assume power, then we must assume the capacity to name and define things. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. Thank you so much for tuning in. The psychology of a culture is to a great extent a symbolic precipitant of the kinds of experiences forced upon a group of people by their history. We must recognize the intimate relationship between culture, history, and personality. If we do not know our history, then we do not know our personality. And if the only history we know is the other people's history, then our personality has been created by that history. We must recognize this in the case of European history. It is not so much that we know European history, because 90% of us don't know European history and have not read it, but that we are left with some image of it, some residue of it, that we have a sense of it, is all the hegemonic European needs to begin to dominate and to control non European peoples. History as mythology. I'm going to look briefly at European history as mythology, as propaganda, and as the creator of personality, which it is. It is mythology, European mythology, a European hallucination, can only work against us where there is an absence of contact with reality, an absence of knowledge of African history. We hallucinate every night. These hallucinations are called dreams, and they occur at the point where we become detached from reality. We must maintain our mental balance and sense of self by input of our senses. It is necessary that for human beings to maintain sanity, that they receive random input and changing input from the world. That is why we suffer so much when we are put into solitary confinement, where we can't see or hear anything. We may begin to have visions and hallucinations as a result thereof. There are what we call desensitization experiments. Some of us might have gotten a chance to see the movie Altered States that speaks to this kind of experience where when you remove a person's capacity to see, feel, hear, touch, and so forth, very peculiar things happen to the mind. Hallucinations begin to occur. Orientation is lost. The individual becomes imbalanced because the information that's normally used to maintain mental equilibrium is absent. We're in a similar state when we are asleep and the mind creates its own reality, its own movie show, and we watch it throughout the night. Often we don't know that we are in an unreal world until we wake up the next morning. Mythology and hallucinations, such as those Europeans' history represents, can take us where it has taken us only as a result of the fact that we are not in touch with reality, not in touch with our African history in a realistic sense. European history is written in such a way or projected in such a way that we become detached and disconnected from the reality that maintains our sanity, maintains our balance and orientation. We then can fall victim to creative visions and hallucinations, delusions and illusions. In the final analysis, European history's principal function is to first separate us from the reality of ourselves and separate us from the reality of the world, to separate us from the reality of our history and to separate us from its ramifications. We will then take the hallucinations which result from these separations as representing what is real. That is the primary function as mythology. From the first day a reporter asked the first tough question of a government official, there has been a debate about whether government has the right to lie. It does. And in certain circumstances, government not only has the right, but a positive obligation to lie. This is stated by Jody Powell, who served under former President Jimmy Carter as press secretary in his book, The Other Side of History. A very interesting admission. Many have heard me say that Europeans, who comprise 10% of the world's population, can only rule over the other 90% by lying, by deceit and force. The only way that we can be in the condition we are in as a people is to believe lies. Our mentality has been reversed and our behavior made backwards because we take the lie for the truth and the truth for the lie. A small minority in the world can only rule by making backwards the mentality of the large majority. It makes mentally backward the large majority by reversing the truth, creating lies, and getting the majority to believe the lies that it creates. Powell honestly admitted it. European historiography lies in many ways. It even lies when ostensibly telling the truth. An effective propagandist doesn't want to tell too many big lies, too many obvious lies. He wants to tell the truth in a sort of way that gets him where he wants to go. We have to recognize that European history writing is an institution the way any other discipline is an institution, and the function of institutions in any oppressive society is to maintain the status quo. I don't care what institution we may be talking about, whether we talk about the family institution, the criminal justice institution, the economic institution, the religious institutions, the health establishment, the educational institutions. They all have one thing in common in a Eurocentric oppressive system: to maintain the status quo and to maintain African people in oppression. We must keep this in mind. It is not so much that what they say or they don't say or they don't say they represent. It is how they function that is of importance. The European writing of history is in tandem with everything else European, and its purpose is ultimately the same: to maintain European power and domination. European historiography does does this by a number of means. It may do it by the pure falsification and concealment of history, by omission and by commission. It may do it by what I call a theft of history. We, in studying Egyptology, are trying to take back what European historiography has stolen, completely falsified, to erase the new false identities it placed on the African Egyptian people. Or when there isn't a direct lie, we get a history book that's written about Egyptians without any reference to ethnicity. We have an unwritten rule which says that if ethnicity is not mentioned, then we are talking about white folks. That rule has been so deeply ingrained within us that we can see real history about ourselves in great detail, but project whiteness right into it and whitewash our own identity. We have been set up by Eurocentric historiography in such a way that when the word slave is mentioned, we assume that they are talking about us, African people. So we read about slaves in history and right away assume they must be talking about colored folks, as if no other people have ever been enslaved but Black people. In other words, historiography can create an outright lie, as it often does, or present itself neutrally, non ethnically, and achieve deceptive ends since it has already set us up to misperceive reality and truth. The Eurocentric historiography so beautifully sets us up that we supply the lie while looking directly at truth. This society gets away by pretending that it is free and open. Ladies and gentlemen, it does provide tremendous amounts of information and puts that information right in our neighborhoods, right before our eyes. We're just overrun with information. There's so much information in libraries until one young man went into one and just by reading found out how to develop an atomic bomb, the mechanism, the whole thing, not from classified data, but data right on the library shelves. He had to have intentions and needs to do that, didn't he? He had to have goals, values, other things that took him to those books. And those mental structures allowed him to pull out the relevant information and piece it together. Without appropriate motivation and motivational structures, information can be put right before our very faces and we will gain nothing from it. So we're in the situation as Black people where the information is put right before our faces and we gain relatively little from it. It can only be put before our faces the way it is because we have been so mentally and motivationally structured that we will not and cannot take the information and transform it to our own advantage. Therefore, this country talks about freedom of information. See, we let them read anything, but it goes back to the phrase the best way to hide anything from a Negro is to put it in writing. Historiography may function as propaganda being an effort to persuade people to a point of view on an issue. History can be used to intimidate. European achievements are inflated, and the next thing we know, we are asking ourselves, how can we fight this great people? We've been frightened. They talk about the great discoveries they've made, and we say to ourselves, hey, we better hang in with these people because if we lose them, we're going back to the dark ages. We think this way because they've destroyed our confidence, our capacity to think for ourselves, and to believe that we are capable of creating a world as great or greater than the Eurocentric one that presently exists. In this way, European historiography functions to maintain a social system, to psychologize, to create a personality orientation in its readers or hearers. If we forget every fact and detail of inflated Eurocentric history, its intimidatory impression stays with us even when the content is lost. That's the point of it, to leave the impression, because the impression will become a dynamic source of behavioral orientation toward the world, the mental enslavement. They are after your consciousness. Greetings, forecast. Thanks for tuning in. The European doesn't care whether or not we remember the facts and the details, as long as we remember the impression, as long as our personalities have been impressed and transformed in a fashion compatible with European interests. Historiography may be used and function to rationalize ideology and justify the status quo, to motivate activity and to create consciousness. We see that all the time. The rationalization of slavery through the use of history, the rationalization of European domination through the use of history. Why is our cultural history stolen from us? So that we can think that we had no culture until Europeans gave us his or projected his own upon us, so that we can feel that we are not capable of a culture, of the developing of a culture of our own, one that could be respected the world over, so that we develop an inferiority complex and the other kinds of complexes we talk about so often today. When you steal a people's history, you can justify ruling over them and thus justify domination. More importantly, history may be used to influence personality, culture, roles, and to motivate us to commit suicide, to provoke us to commit menticide, and may be used to create or rationalize fratricide, genocide, and self destruction. That is the ultimate objective of cultural misorientation, in my opinion. But we'll go on. How many times have we, maybe in our own personal lives, attacked someone because we were given the wrong history about them? How many murders have been perpetuated because someone believed a lie? How many wars have been started because the population was lied to and a history projected in such a way that it motivated them to kill? A bogus, thoroughly wrong fabrication can lead one to imprisonment, can lead one to murder, or lead to wars, or to being killed and destroyed. There is a direct connection between history and the way people behave and act, between what one thinks of as history and killing, death, destruction, and imprisonment. So, history is no casual thing that one picks up while passing through school. It becomes a part of one's total orientation toward the world. If it were not, why then does the European see himself as the sole valid historian in the world and tries to see himself as the only one who should determine what history is? We are, to a great extent, what we are today as a people as the result of believing lies presented as truth. We must recognize that this often comes in the guise of history. Eurocentric history most popularly functions as mythology. Did you hear that? It functions as mythology. Mythology has many functions. We can't go into them here today due to time constraints. Mythology often can be seen as a form of denial of reality. If a memory is too painful to be recalled, if recalling it means suffering, pain, shame, guilt, or other negative things, the individual may not only deny the reality of that memory and experience, but may actually create a mythology in their places. By becoming obsessed and caught up in that mythology, he uses it as a means of keeping out his conscious memory of the traumatic experience that he fears. The European must undoubtedly fear the truth of African history. Recall the phrase, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And if we are not free today, then we must not know the truth. If Eurocentric history and other disciplines are true, then why aren't we free? The knowledge of truth threatens those who wish to imprison us, keep us imprisoned, and keep us dominated. The projection of the European version of history into our minds as mythology is a way of repressing truth within our own minds and within our breasts as a people. European historiography functions to maintain repression. Often, the person represses painful information that threatens his equilibrium because he may be profiting by the lies that he tells himself and others. The European profits by the lies he tells, the false perceptions and consciousness he creates in himself and others. Therefore, the truth and a more realistic history threatens these gains. His self esteem and vision of who he is and what he is maintained through the projection of his history as mythology. That's one of the functions of mythology, to maintain self esteem. The European projection of history not only serves to drive out and repress truth, but also to maintain the inflated European ego. Therefore, truthful history is not only seen as a correction of his history, but as a direct attack against his ego, status, and position in the world. That's why African centered history is reacted to with such great anxiety. That's why almost anything African is reacted to with alarm. But it is only through Africanness, only through the projection of the truth of Africanness, that our freedom can be attained as a people and European domination brought to an end. Whether a mythology is perceived to be true or false is sociologically unimportant. Some blacks would debate that Elijah Muhammad's view of the world about the white man being the devil. Of course, the Negro who doesn't want to do anything gets into the fine points of that. He's very careful to distinguish the good ones from the bad ones and the ones in between. He has graduated, he has a graduated measuring rod. He works them out by degrees. But when the white man's enforced segregation down south, the good black folk and the bad black folk sat right in the back of the bus. It didn't matter. The mythology didn't differentiate. You're black, get back. That's the deal. You're bad. The function was not that of telling truth. The idea was how that mythology, in other words, all blacks are bad, helped maintain the racial status quo. The idea is not whether whites are devils or angels, but what would happen if we dealt with whites as if they were devils. How would that transform our situation as a people? How would that transform our behavior as a people? Would it move us closer to doing for self? Would it move us closer to controlling our destinies, our own behaviors, gaining control of our economies and our nations? Would it remove us from being manipulated and used by another system? It is not about truth alone. It is about self control. It is about the gaining of power. It is about being able to protect and advance our survival. But if we get caught up in the minutia of trying to figure out whether there are good ones and bad ones and others in between, we may find ourselves being destroyed in our studies. The forecast says facts on that part. There is no good or bad blacks. If you black, you black. And that he doesn't agree with calling them devils, though. That's giving them too much credit and defying them and deifying them. That's why we have to recognize that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was the greatest psychologist we ever had. And many of us still have not come to understand that yet. Some of us thought that we were doing our intellectual thing when we got all caught up trying to point out his mythologies. Not at all. We must look at its function. Where are the brothers that hear about the good whites? The brothers that hear about the good whites are dead at the hands of the good whites. Whether it's a good white woman that shoots you because she came home drunk and was tells the police that she was cleaning her gun and she blows your brains out, or she's the good white friend whose house you spend the night over and you wake up the next morning dead and nobody knows anything, or you're the one black guy on the fishing trip and you wind up dead, but you were athletic and a swimmer, but you wind up drowned having gone on a fishing trip with your good white friends. So European history, whether it is true to the extent and or in the context within which it is projected, or whether it is false, is not the ultimate point. It's the fact that it functions as a mythology, and as mythology, it functions to maintain European power, domination, and control. It is our attack against it as mythology that we must be concerned with as African people, because the mythology becomes part of our mental structure. It is used as a tool of intellection, a tool of comprehension, a tool of dealing with the world and relating to the world. A mythology organizes the world, organizes behavior, it organizes interpersonal and intergroup relations. Whatever mythology we believe is one that organizes our approach to the world and to other people, our perception of ourselves and of other people. It provides answers. The answers may not be right, they may be wrong, but it still provides an answer, and it's psychologically satisfying. Nothing threatens us and nothing upsets us like unanswered questions. Often, man projects a mythology in order to get himself out of his agony of dealing with unanswered questions and to put his mind at rest. Oh, KW97 highlighted another good white person. Amber Geiger was a good white woman who ended up going into the wrong apartment, killing a black man who was sitting in his own apartment, but she thought she was at home. And his brother had the nerve to sit there and cry and want to give her a hug and talk about how he forgave her. What world is this that we are living in? We have to recognize the function of mythology, since mythology seeks to mold character and to motivate as well as to demotivate. Mythology often takes control in the domain of discourse, in the sense that just the presentation of European history, leaving African history aside, implies that African history is not worth learning. I often tell college students that you look at your college catalog and you see a course in there and assume that because it's in the catalog, it's worth learning. You say to yourself, if it's not there, then it must not be worth learning, because if it was worth learning, it would be there. You look at the list of required courses and you don't see anything about your history as being required. You assume that the most important courses are required, and since the ones relating to us are not required, then they must not be important. Just reading just the reading of the catalog inflates one group and deflates the other. It creates a superiority complex in one and inferiority complex in the other. When we name things, when we speak of things in order to exclude contrary truths, we create and uncreate reality. This is the role of that European historiography has aggregated to itself. So, as you can see, history is very important. And we have to get to the point where we're learning our history. And that's a personal history and a collective history, because we had a history before slavery. We had a history that was full of life and complex people that were beautiful, that grew their own medicine, that developed math, that developed higher concepts of math and psychology, that had social hierarchies, we ruled. We ruled. Okay. History and societal amnesia. History is a time dimension. History constructs time. I frequently try to point out that culture is not only about behavior, dress, and so forth, but that all cultures have a time dimension related to them. I talk about this relative to the education of our children to indicate that our children are often flunked and destroyed by the time structured of schools they attend. Who told us that classes only have to last 45 minutes? Okay. Oh, the white folks teach theirs 45 minutes. But that apparently is a time system that's connected to and works for them. That is in some way intimately connected to their history and experience. When we look at ourselves, are we going to tell ourselves that our children are destroyed by the after effects of our enslavement, Jim Crowism, miseducation, poor self image, all the other things we moan and groan about, and yet we don't make time in a curriculum for instructing them as to remove these obstacles of learning? If not, then we will destroy them. Therefore, our time system for teaching our children cannot be a duplicate of the European time system. We must recognize there's a time dimension related to our history and ourselves as a people. In knowing our history, We get to know our time dimension. We get to know how much time has to be dedicated to various tasks if we are to achieve what we need to achieve. Forget about other people's time. Who gives a hoot about whether our children are reading ahead or behind white children? Who told us they had to read the same thing at the same time at the same age? If they have a different history, a different experience, different goals, and different ways, then doesn't it stand to reason that they may be achieving different milestones at different times? But it's the very fact that we try to impose the time system of another people upon our children that creates the so called deviations we complain about so much, and our children are destroyed in the process. So when we let another people write history, and history is an arbitrary division of time, they define us within that division of time. We see European history talking about World War I, World War II, etc. That's not the only way to divide up time in terms of wars. No, we have been at war with the European continuously for the last 2,000 years, a non-stop war. The forecast says, according to studies, Black children learn much quicker than white kids. But when we internalize European divisions of time, it takes us away from our own history and from understanding our own adversarial relationship with them and other people, and takes us completely outside of ourselves. Therefore, history as mythology, even if it tells the truth, by the very fact of its structuring of time, can still be used as propaganda to manipulate and create unreality in consciousness. European history, to a considerable degree, attempts to control consciousness by the way it is presented. We saw a movie called The Birth of a Nation. Why not The Death of a Nation? Indigenous America, the so called Indian nations, existed at the time. At the same time, we speak of the birth of some nations, other nations were dying, but we are focused on their so called birth. Even more pernicious than this is the fact that many of our people feel as if they do not come into existence and self consciousness until they have been recognized by European historians. So Columbus discovers America, and it's almost as if the Indian comes into reality and into self consciousness as the result of Columbus's discovery. Before that time, they were nothing, dead. And many of us still have that deep psychology that we are invisible people until white folks recognize that we exist. It is a heavy psychology that rules us today. We are not famous until they make us famous. We are not anything until they make us something. Before that, we are nothing. History as propaganda, history as mythology creates and brings into consciousness. History by Europeans is seen as a validation of truth. It establishes authority. It's a puzzling situation, as I've often pointed out to my students, that we use as arbiters of truth those who have lied to us the most. These are the kinds of contradictions that keep us crazy, and they are widespread. Consequently, we can only feel it is truth when it comes out of a European historical mouth solely. So we have to define time. We can't define time based on the way that they define time because they define time in totally different ways. Do you understand? The consequences of historical amnesia. In the interest of time, I'll just end my analysis of European history and look a bit at another issue. I'm really more concerned about what happens when we don't know or forget our own history. Eurocentric history is used to motivate forgetting in the African personality, to create amnesia, to maintain repression. Many of us, as individuals, seek to forget our history and do not want to confront our history because of the anxiety, the anger, the fear, the shame, the guilt we feel when we read about some aspects of the African experience, and hence will often stay away from it. We think we have escaped its effects thereby. We can hear some of our uninformed children say, well, that was back there 100 years ago. That ain't got nothing to do with me today. The Black child at this very moment is still affected and suffering from the slave experience, whether he or she knows it or not. In fact, as Russell Jacoby says in his book, Social Amnesiac, exactly because the past is forgotten, it rules unchallenged. To be transcended, it must be remembered. Social amnesia is society's repression of remembrance. And that is why I say the Ma'afa is the greatest crime in human history and is ongoing. Simply because we choose to forget a traumatic event, simply because we choose not to learn of a traumatic history and a history that may make us feel ashamed, does not mean that that history is not controlling our behavior. Simply because we don't know our history and may not have heard of it does not mean that the history does not control our behavior. One of the most profound things that we've learned in psychology is that the most powerful forces that shape human behavior are those factors that are consciously not remembered by human beings, that are unknown by the person, are those experiences the individual can swear he'd never had. That is one of the paradoxes of human behavior, that the very things that shape us and make us behave the way we do, see the world the way we see it, and relate to people the way we relate to them, are those things that occurred in our lives at points we cannot remember or recall. The personality is in part shaped in the womb itself, shaped by the genes, see Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy, shaped in part by the birth process itself, shaped in the very first 2 years of life. Yet very few, if any of us, can remember any detail those first 2 years of life. Yet it is those very first 2 years that determine our behavior from 8 to 80. And so the idea that we don't know, that we're not aware of certain early experiences, does not mean that we have escaped their effects. In fact, it puts us more profoundly under the influence of these unknown forces. Amnesia is a state where a person seeks unconsciously to forget aspects of his or her past life because apparently those aspects are painful, and therefore the individual seeks to rid himself of them. Consequently, by ridding himself of his conscious remembrance of painful experiences, he seeks to rid himself of anxieties and fears connected with them. He may then succeed in forgetting those experiences completely to the point where he cannot recall them. But this does not mean that those experiences do not continue to operate within his personality. There are those of us who are made ashamed of our history of enslavement, who are made ashamed of the distorted presentation of African history, which is why the European distorts it and presents it the way he does, are made to think that the prior to slavery, we were essentially culturally invisible and savage and only achieved visibility and civility when the European came on the scene. Many of us are attempt to repress any knowledge of our American slave experience, but we should heed to the fact that a person and people who suffer from social amnesia live lives that are determined by fear, anxiety, and trauma. When we attempt to escape our history because we're afraid of it, when we escape knowledge because it terrifies and makes us feel ashamed, when then it is terror and fear and shame that determine our lives. When we then live not in terms of our reality and in terms of the integration of our reality, but in terms of what we are afraid of. In other words, what we are ashamed of, what we are trying to hide, what we are trying not to confront ourselves with. Life is then lived in terms of denial, in terms of escape and addiction. Many of the murderers and deaths and much of the destruction that we see in our communities today are the result of people trying to escape history and living their lives in terror and fear of their own history and reality. That is why I contend that history is directly related to our concrete existence. It is not something you happen to take in school. It is a part of our real lives because without it, it will make us take dope, kill, steal, and it'll make us do all kinds of terrible things because our lives are not determined by relating to history appropriately, but determined by fear. Those people and parents who have escaped their own history as a result of trying to escape anxiety, fear, shame, and so forth, many pass escapism to their onto their children as history. That history of escapism then becomes a part of their personality, and they become vulnerable to addiction and all other kinds of terrible habits and orientations in the world. Why do we think we were robbed of our history if it was not to serve this purpose? Oh, KW Don 7 says, as some people on the internet have said, the transatlantic slave trade never happened. I am indigenous to Turtle Island. There are a lot of people that have that belief, and they have begun to minimize the scope and horrificness of the transatlantic slave trade in an attempt to escape the history of what actually happened to us and deal with it We will be reading when we're done with Kobe Cambone's book, Breeding on the American Coast, because we need to deal with it. We need to deal with some of these traumas and some of these things that have happened to us, because if we don't deal with it, we will never be strong enough to overcome this beast. The individual who has amnesia suffers distortion of and blindness to reality. The individual who cuts himself off from his history is self alienated, which is also one of the stages of cultural misorientation. There's a whole part of himself that's completely shut off from his use. It's as if there were two parts. One part is unknown, yet because it is unknown doesn't mean that it's not effective. We have to devote energy to unknowing. We have to direct perception to unknowing. We have to say, let me turn my face so I cannot see. Let me not think about it. So the struggle not to know itself becomes a creator of behavior and personality structure. So the idea that not knowing one's history somehow permits one to escape it is a lie. In fact, it brings one under the domination of the more pernicious effects of that history and opens the personality up for self alienation and self destruction, which again, self destruction is the ultimate goal of cultural misorientation. A person who is suffering from amnesia lives a life based upon negation, not on affirmation, not on growth and development, but lives life in such a way as to deny life and reality and to deny parts of his own personality and himself. Life then becomes a negation and is used to maintain a negation instead of life as it should be lived, as affirmation, as growth, enhancement, and development. And people who live their lives as negation live the lives that we see ourselves living today, going deeper and deeper into hell and going deeper into self destruction as a people. History is real. It brings real, tangible results. When we wish to negate it and to not integrate it, when we wish to negate it and not affirm it, then it negates us in the end. The negation wins out. The African person who lives in social amnesia brought on by the projection of mythological Eurocentric history lives a life that is unintegrated and misunderstood. Why is our behavior so puzzling to us? We sometimes ask ourselves, why did I do that? I don't know what makes me do this. Here's behavior flowing out from our own mind and personality, and we don't know its sources. It means that we become a puzzlement to ourselves, the ones we think that we should understand best. Often, other people can understand us better than we can understand ourselves. Frequently, they have a greater knowledge of the history that made us into who we are than we do. If we don't know our history, or if we've made our history unconscious and therefore placed it out of awareness, that unconscious history becomes a source of unconscious motivation. Then why we behave the way we do becomes a puzzle. We're confused by our own behavior. If we want to know why we behave the way we do, then we must know our history. The unconscious must be made conscious. Consequently, when the European makes us unconscious of our own history, we not only become unconscious of our history as knowledge, we become unconscious of the sources of our behavior as persons and as a people, and our own behavior becomes a mystery. Why do Black folk act like that? We get discouraged. We give up. We ain't going to straighten them, in other words, Black people, out, man, because we can't figure it out. When history is misperceived and we look to a white Jesus and we pray to a white Jesus, then walk out and see poverty, smell the stench, see the drugs, people holding babies up to shield themselves from bullets, and all this kind of stuff, it's not difficult for us to step over a thin line that says, Boy, we must have done something really terrible in the past for us to be suffering the way that we do. It's another form of escapism. If you recognize it, put it in the chat. As much as we pray to Jesus for us to be suffering the way we do, God must have cursed us, we surmise. Then we're ready for the old Ham mythology. We set ourselves up and we introject inferiority onto ourselves. We take it into our breast and pass it on to our children, and we are done in. This is what happens when we don't know our history and don't know the history of other people. They are some Negroes who seek to escape their history and identity by telling themselves, I don't see color. Well, do you think that means the world doesn't see you as colored? A lot of people fail to understand that because they may choose to not see something in a certain way, that other people may still choose to do so. That assertion of I don't see color doesn't change the way that other people look at them. In fact, this perceptual misdirection sets them up to be manipulated. Almost every day, we hear Negroes say that they have been manipulated and are being manipulated in some sort of way. In fact, they often say it to justify their being manipulated and not confronting their reality. Because they don't want to deal with the realistic situation that they live in, they want to deny the Europeans' terroristic rule on earth, deny his evil, deny his domination over them, and deny his destruction of the earth and life itself. So they choose not to see color. So they can't see white folks for what they can't see white for what it is. They use it to justify not knowing their own history and not knowing themselves because they don't see color, thereby maintaining the amnesia. When we get into social amnesia, into forgetting our history, we are also forget we also forget to misinterpret the history and motives of others as well as our own motives. The way to know other people is to know one's self. The way to learn of our own creation, how we came to be what we are, is getting to know ourselves. It is through getting to know the self intimately, we get to know the forces that shaped us. Therefore, knowing the self becomes a knowledge of the world. A deep study of Black history is the most profound way to learn about the psychology of Europeans and to understand the psychology that flows from their history. If we don't know ourselves, not only are we a puzzle to ourselves, other people are also a puzzle to us as well. We assume the wrong identity and identify ourselves with our enemies. We don't know who we are. Then, if we don't know who we are, then we are whomever somebody else tells us we are. If we don't know who we are whomever somebody else tells us we are. KW Don 7 says, we stopped following the Levitical laws of the Bible. That is why we were taken into slavery. That's what another interesting group says. That's why I say, if you're not going to use that book for your liberation, leave that book alone. Everybody that uses that book, not everybody, that's not true, not everybody, but most people that use that book to find some other way to justify slavery and to be re-enslaved. They use that book to justify slavery and to be re enslaved. And if you want true freedom and liberty, you have to read beyond the tales of bondage and stop looking for a reason why, because it's not in that history book. It is in a different book of history because white people tell you what they did. They settled in your lands, they sexually and socially integrated into your communities and into your power structure. And then when they got to the top, they married themselves. Or they came and made you fight among yourselves. And then when you got weak, then they fought you. Or they came and dominated and controlled you. Or because they had the gun. Or they came and advised and offered your brothers consumable goods for people after you had lost a war to them, and your brethren didn't have a concept and understanding of slavery, and they thought that slavery would be the type of slavery that they practiced, not this horrible chattel slavery that they practice here in America, and they sold you into slavery. So there are multiple origin stories. All of history is true. All of history is not true just for you. It is best for you to find your most powerful ancestor and figure yourself out and know your family history. But all of those stories are true because I have met people from different backgrounds that have those stories in their backgrounds, and I have seen those stories in different books and documented in different ways because Europeans tell you the truth when they don't think you listening. If anyone wants to come up, let me know. But yeah, history is very important. History is so important that they spend millions of dollars changing history and rewriting history books and trying to twist history so that they come out as these wonderful people that are victorious. They mythologize themselves in history. I was talking to a friend yesterday from New York, and he was talking about Greek history. And I realized I have forgotten all of the Greek history that I knew in college because it's no longer important. And I just did have done a huge brain dump. So I remember some of their stories, but what I remember most about white people is that they glorified pedophilia, homosexuality, and bestiality, and they wrote about it in their myths. That they glorify homosexuality, that they anything that is against creation is something that they are here for. And they are truly alien to harmony in the earth. And it is a shame that now, in order in some areas to learn indigenous African spirituality, you have to go to a white presenting person to learn some of the initiatory steps and phases of things like Santeria and Ifa, and in some cases voodoo, because they have picked it up. And I wouldn't say that they are a good white person. I would say that they're an interesting capitalistic white person because they have found out and figured out a way to commoditize and capitalize on your spirituality by selling it back to you. That's why I say if you have to start with the Bible and backtrack, do that. If you have to talk to your parents and figure out what things that they did, if you have to start with an herbalist book, do that. Whatever you have to start with, you need to find your way back so that you have a spiritual core, so that as you begin to learn things about your family and what your people went through, and as you begin to learn history more, or if you know history, um, you are able to look beyond the veil and you'll begin to understand some things differently, and you'll begin to look at the world with African eyes. All right, guys. I try hard not to hold you guys long. I appreciate you. Thank you, KW Don 7 and Forecast and Sister Raw and the elders for being here. I know that Koku is listening. I know that John Henry is listening. I know that Anthony McPhail is listening. I know that Bawana Hagaziki is listening, and so many others. I appreciate each and every one of you. I value the support that you show me and this broadcast, and I want you to remember every single thing that touches your life, whether it is religious, social, or political, must be an instrument of your liberation, or you must throw it into the ash can of history. If I did not say your name, charge it to my head and not my heart, because you know you are my people. Thanks for listening. I will be back Monday, and that is March the 31st. I will be back Monday, March 31st. Thanks for tuning in. Peace, guys.